I want to talk to you about big decisions and how to make them. Let's first clarify what I mean by that. Big decisions are the ones that shape the trajectory of your life. The ones that on your deathbed, if you look back, you'll think about them as the ones that defined who you were. Now, let's start maybe by taking a temperature of the room. By a show of hands, how many of you have proposed to someone or were proposed to? How many of you did it more than once? How many of you here have children? Here's a tricky one. Has anyone ever terminated a pregnancy? Has anyone ever ended someone else's life? Doctor or soldier? Let's make it more mundane. Does anyone here have tattoos? And how about buying something for, say, over $10 million? Has anyone done that? What's common to all of those decisions is that we make them a handful of times in our life, and therefore we don't really have statistics about them. We don't really have a lot of things to rely on. We can't really ask others and take their experiences because it's usually very different. And even if we did it before, oftentimes past experience doesn't apply to the future. Buying a house at 20 is very different than when you do it at 60. You have to optimize for many variables. You might have regrets afterwards. But one thing that's common to many of the decisions is that we rarely get trained on how to make them. So today, I want to change that. Before I do that, I want to convince you that you should listen to me, that I'm an authority in this space. So I'll tell you that I'm a neuroscientist. I spent the last 15 years studying the brain by a unique method where we open human brains, put electrodes inside, and eavesdrop on neurons while people think, feel, dream, and make decisions. And this allows us to understand how people make regular decisions. But critical ones was not my expertise until 3 years ago. It was January 7, 2020, and I was on a phone with a woman called Deborah Rosenblum and found myself asking her to explain to me how she trains the president to make decisions concerning nuclear launch. The reason I asked her that was that she was at the time training Mr. Joe Biden, the incoming president, on making this very choice. Now, I was tasked just that, on implementing neuroscience research to the protocols concerning critical decisions like the nuclear weapons decision. Now, in the US, the president is the only person who gets to decide on nuclear weapons. There's no democracy there, no veto, no checks and balances. And that's true pretty much for the entire set of countries that have them. 9 countries in the world with men, they're all men who have this power. And the question is, how do we do that? The protocols that are being used right now to train presidents on this decision were established about 75 years ago by scientists like me. One of them is economist and Nobel laureate Thomas Schelling, who set the protocol based on his experience in game theory. And he made all kinds of assumptions in the protocol that he himself wrote in the books are flawed, and he hopes they will be changed over time. Many of them were not. One of the assumptions is that the leaders in power are what he calls rational, composed, and measured. Now you can look at the people who recently had this position and ask yourself if you believe that all of them fit this bill. This wasn't the only assumption. He also assumed that because they're so massive, those weapons, people are going to be likely not to use them, since they're going to assume that there's what's called mutually assured destruction. The idea that if I use them, you're going to use them against me and we're both going to die. This also changed recently when people started to think about them as the last resort weapon. I think about them as 2 sworn enemies sitting in a pool of gasoline, arguing who has more matches. And in that sense, this decision is one of the most critical ones we can think about. My colleague and friend, philosopher Sam Harris, said that he's surprised people aren't thinking about it all the time. It's one of those big things that could ruin everyone's life. It's if there's a monster in the room and it's so scary to us that we choose to ignore it. And my answer to him is that it's because of our brain. Our brain is not equipped to think about those big decisions. It evolved in a savanna where we only had to worry about the here and now, what scientists call the 4 Fs: fighting, feeding, fearing, and mating. And in that sense, our inability to think about that is a flaw of the brain that we can maybe fix by thinking differently. So I want to elevate this fear by telling you that not only am I worried as a neuroscientist, I'm worried as a citizen, because the last couple of years have made it even harder for our brain to think about them. There are more threats, more near misses, and more broken arrows. This is the term that scientists give to nuclear bombs that went missing or disappeared. And as a scientist, I can tell you that if you have a name for something, it means it's happening way too often. In fact, one of the cynical jokes among scientists who study nuclear weapons is that the last nuclear explosion was a bomb thrown by the US, not on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but on North Carolina. That's the last broken arrow where a bomb fell off a plane and just didn't explode. So this is something that's happening too often, and the question is how to prepare. So in the next 5 minutes, I want to give you some tips on critical decisions coming from my work with the government over the last 2 years in thinking about critical ones. First, know thyself. It turns out that each of us has a profile that is ideal for decision making. It's not that there is a correct answer on how to make decisions, but there is a correct answer for you. Some of you are better in the morning, some in the evening, some when you're hungry, others when you're full, some when you're alone, others when you're with people. Doesn't matter. But you need to know what are the optimal conditions for you so you can set the environment to work best with those conditions. How do you do that? If you have access to neuroscientists, you can study your brain, but if you don't, you can just keep a diary and experiment. In the next 10 days, you walk in your life, and when you make a choice, you ask yourself, what were the options and how did I feel about it? And you try new things. Maybe one time you go with your gut feelings. Another time you ask a friend to choose for you and you see how this feels. You go to the waiter and you say, give me 5 options, and you agree to choose the second one no matter what. When you do it enough times, you'll get better in knowing what works best for you. Second, decision aids. Some presidents like to see information in a visual way. Others want it in a table of pros and cons. Recently, we experimented with using AI as a decision tool that is very rational. The point is that for every person, there's a different tool that works for them. And if you identify what works for you in regular decisions, it's going to be even more useful when you get to the critical ones. 3, numbers. You don't have to be a mathematician or a statistician, but you have to have a sense of how you approach numbers. If you're an expecting mother and doctors tell you that you have 1 in 20 billion chance of having a problem, and then they say, sorry, 1 in 21 billion. What does it matter to you? How do you change your view, or just thinking that it's a lot? I was recently asked to help the security authority at the airport, where they see suitcases in the machine and they have to identify a bomb. And the reality is that most agents will never see a bomb if they happen 1 in 20 billion times, let's say. Which means that their brain will train to miss them. They're just going to press next, 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 and miss the real one. So how do we make their brain actually approach it differently? What we did then is we introduced fake bombs into the machine that they have to catch, otherwise they lose their job. And in that sense, you train them to see things in higher probability. Know what biases are and how to approach them. Neuroscientists and behavioral economists in the last decades have figured out tons of biases that are predictably happening again and again. Things like optimism bias, the idea that things are going to look better, or default biases, the preference to not change things if they're already set, or if you're working in a group, conformity, or the idea that if you hear something multiple times, it must be more true. All those biases, because they're predictable, can be avoided if you just know about them. But here's the thing, there's something even better. And that is the ultimate solution to biases, and maybe the most important point of all. Set a protocol. Way before you get your critical choice, agree how you're going to approach it in terms of who gets to decide, just you or many people. If there are many people, who gets to vote? Everyone or only people who are informed? If you vote, what's a majority? Is 9-1 same as 6-4? Or maybe you require unanimous voting? Are you voting anonymously or public? How do you present the options? Do you tell people there are 10 nuclear options in different ranges and 11th which is not nuclear? Or do you say first nuclear or not? And then if you say nuclear, you go to the 10 options. And who gets to be in the room? Kennedy famously asked to be out of the room when deliberations happen, so you wouldn't influence the choice, because as we know, a leader who's in the room oftentimes shapes how people talk. If your boss tells you, I think we should do this, what do you think? It's very likely that you're gonna have a hard time being in opposition. And speaking of opposition, having a red team is typically helpful. What is a red team? It's a person who you assign to be the voice of the opposition. It's a role of someone who has to think differently than you and give you counter arguments. And it's important to rotate this role and not keep it to the same person, otherwise you start hating that person and forget that they have a role. And generally, if you can, having multiple voices in the room is typically helpful, and you have to balance that with convergence and time. Now, there's the option of rehearsal. Now, rehearsal is tricky. It's not that you have to rehearse, but you have to have a view on whether you rehearse or not. In France, the nuclear protocol says that there are no rehearsals. You never try anything, so no one's going to know how the president thinks and influence them. In the US, rehearsals are mandatory. Every 4 months, you have to have a rehearsal. However, the last guy to do it was Jimmy Carter in 1980. Every president since somehow finds a way to not do it when they come, and they kind of send an intern instead to do it instead. And there's a type of rehearsal that is highly recommended called pre-mortem, which is an exercise that basically says, let's assume that things failed and ask what could have led to this failure. So I proposed to her, she said no, what could I have done differently before? This will allow you to think of things and see maybe things that are blind spots right now. And finally, one thing that TED doesn't really support is giving you more time. You know, you all have seen this countdown timer in movies. In real life, it's not a great idea. If you can take more time, it's always a good idea to take more time, because the brain takes of decisions like a toll. We actually know that when you make a decision, it doesn't matter what decision is, you have a spike of dopamine in your brain as a reward for making decisions, which means that it's taking some energy from us. So if you can give it time, you'll find it useful. President Obama famously took a break of one night after all the discussions before he decided to launch the attack against Osama bin Laden. And President Clinton famously sat in the room with the crossword puzzles that he solved before a big choice to give his brain a break. And it's going to be true for you as well. Whether you're a leader, a president, a business, or incoming one that just starts their life, knowing how to make decisions is going to prove valuable. And I'm going to end by reminding you of the stakes when it comes to those. Choices, in many ways, define our life. In every book, in every movie, there's a moment of a choice to be or not to be that shapes the future of the characters. And these characters are you. And when it comes to big ones, many times they could end everyone's life if taken in the wrong way. Albert Einstein, when he was once asked about the weapons by which World War III will be, he said, I don't know about World War III, but World War IV is going to be sticks and stones again. And Robert Oppenheimer, who was the first guy to sit at the helm of the nuclear decision protocol, when witnessing the first test for a nuclear bomb, quoted from the Bhagavad Gita and said, I am now become death, the destroyer of worlds. And finally, Enrico Fermi, who famously thought about the possibility of having intelligent life form out there, said that the probability of aliens out there is very high, so how come we don't see them? And his answer was that every intelligent civilization at some point creates the tools that end up destructing it. In that sense, we're in a bad shape. But there's hope. One approach is to think that we're like the person falling off a building, and as long as they don't hit the ground, they say everything is good so far. Basically rely on luck. Another one is to develop ways to think about choices differently. I'm an optimist, so I'm going to give you my optimal decision protocol. It's created by Richard Feynman and it has 3 steps. Step 1, write down the problem. Step 2, think very hard. Step 3, write down the answer. For Feynman, this works. For the rest of us, we need a few more things in between. And implementing those things will help you have a better life, whether you're a president or just making small decisions in your world that don't impact others' lives. The thing about those decisions is that they will help you save the world, whether you're making critical ones or not, because you're going to strive towards a better one. If nothing else, it will make you avoid making big decisions in the realm of tattoos. Thank you so much.
I am meeting